Leaving the town of Whittier, I left through the Whittier Tunnel and headed back towards the interior of Alaska, 100 miles to Palmer. Palmer was a cute little town with just under 6,000 residents. Across the park were beautiful views of mountains, and opposite the park was a small street with little shops, bars, and restaurants on one side. Palmer was one of the cleanest towns I visited on the road trip, and like every place you visit in Alaska, whether it's a small town or community or a large city, you saw mountains in the distance no matter what direction you looked in. If you ever think about coming to Alaska and want to live in a small town that is conveniently located, look no further than Palmer. After Palmer, I stopped at Matanuska River Scenic View, and this was just a tourist attraction basically looking down and through a valley that has the Matanuska River running through it. The first thing that comes to mind when you're looking down in the valley is how incredible it would be to walk through the valley, even if you're not a hiker yourself. So if you're coming to Alaska to do some hiking, I would highly recommend checking out this location. The next stop on my road trip was the small town of Chickaloon, with 254 residents. I stopped in downtown, which was nothing more than a couple of abandoned rustic buildings and a dirt road. There were no signs of life except for me there. Like many other of the small interior communities, Chickaloon had a very calm and peaceful setting. I then drove on to Long Lake, and exactly as it sounds, this was just a very long lake along the roadside. Occasionally a car would pass by, and that made this spot a little less enjoyable than it would have been if it was off on a side road. You have no privacy even if you are the only person there with the passing cars, and there is also only a very small spot where travelers can pull off to look at the lake. But the sounds of cars driving by every 3 to 4 minutes made this a place I wouldn't stop by again, or recommend. Leaving Long Lake, I drove to Glacier View, and although there was a little more traffic there than I had expected, this is a place with amazing views and was one of the more beautiful places I stopped along the trip. While on the road in Glacier View, you have a perfect clear view of the massive Matanuska Glacier, and this is the only glacier in North America that you can drive right up to and walk on. Consider taking a guided hiking tour on the glacier. There were many other tours offered in this area, including zipline tours and rafting tours. And they also rent out Jeeps and ATVs where you could splash through the scenery on an exciting off-road adventure. But the most well-known event in Glacier View is the Glacier View Car Launch, which is held every 4th of July. It involves cars, trucks, and RVs rolling off of a cliff and falling down 300 feet to their doom. This tradition started back in the early 2000s, and I plan on heading back there this summer to watch the car launch my first time. From there, I drove to the small town of Eureka with a population of 24, also known as Eureka Roadhouse. What I particularly liked about this area was regardless of what direction you looked in, you got a strong feeling of how small you are in this part of Alaska. You're basically standing in the middle of the wild, untamed land. It's an eerie yet fascinating feeling that creeps through your bones while standing there. The next 3 communities I stopped at were almost identical to Eureka. They had the same landscapes and the same feelings that you had in Eureka, as well as tall mountains sitting in the distance. First, I came across the community of Nelchina, where 45 people live. If you ever drive along this way, you need to stop at the Grizzly Country Store. The Grizzly Country Store looked the same as every other souvenir shop that you come across in almost every small remote community in Alaska, and the owners are almost always veterans in their 70s or 80s who came to Alaska to live in remote areas after leaving wars and to get away from the rest of the world. But I don't think most of us, including myself, really understand why they came here. You can look at their lives as a sad story if you choose. A young man goes through hard times and has experiences that most of us will never have, and gives up on life to live all alone away from people in remote Alaska. Most of the time it is true that they saw horrendous acts of violence and much more death and torture than anyone should see in 20 lifetimes. But I believe after speaking with several of them along my trip that they just want peace for the rest of their lives after going through what they did. They seem to see things in a much different perspective than most of us do. They choose peaceful scenery and take the time to appreciate nature rather than doing mundane, unimportant tasks that all of us do every day. And the hard winters living in remote Alaska is nothing compared to what they've gone through in their lives. The stories they tell you when you stop by their shops will keep you there for an entire afternoon, because you quickly realize you're in the presence of someone who seems to see something in this part of the world that you don't see, or that you need to be taught to see. Leaving Nelchina, I arrived at Mendeltna with a population of 36. Mendeltna was just another small community that did not have much to offer except for the views. I then came to Tolsona, which has 12 residents. To me, Tolsona was the end of the middle of nowhere driving through the interior of Alaska. Like the previous small communities, with the exception of the souvenir shop in Nelchina, Tolsona didn't have any types of shops. It was just mountains and forest and stillness. If you want to live remote yet not be far from a grocery store, Tolsona would be a good place for you, as the next town over with a few shops is only 12 miles away, which is where I will pick up in the next video.